So, as you mentioned, I'm an orthopedic surgeon, but I've got an interest in basic science. And I can see so many of you have logged on tonight, so you must also have that same interest in learning more. And I remember when I was studying for my exam, lots of the things that we were studying seemed to make quite a lot of intuitive sense. I was pretty comfortable with some of the basic science, like the anatomy. But then suddenly there was this whole subject about materials and material science and material behavior that we've never covered in medical school. We've never covered really in great detail anywhere else. And I was very intimidated by it. And I sort of made it a point of interest to try and learn as much as I could. And I've been teaching this particular area now for probably about 8 years. And this little talk, which I hope will get you through it's designed just to get you through mainly the questions about the materials that you might use in orthopedics and to get you through any questions about the stress strain graph. So we have a limited objective, but on the other hand, I hope by the end of this sort of half an hour, you'll feel pretty comfortable with some of those things. So this is just before we start, this is just to give you an idea. This is taken from Ortho Bullets about the high yield basic science topics that come up in the MCQs. And you can see that orthopedic implants and material properties of implants are unusually high compared to perhaps some of the other things that you think come up. And so I do think this is a pretty important subject for us to get to grips with. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the definitions, some of the terms that are used in material science, and just try and make them clear for us all. And then I'm going to really focus in on the stress strain graph and what we can learn from it and where we can get some of those definitions. And then just towards the end of the talk, I want to talk specifically about hip and knee replacement, because that's the kind of question you might get asked in a VIVA, and that'll be some of my case presentations along the lines of, oh, you know, Alan, what hip replacement do you use? And you think it's going to be a question about the evidence base for a certain prosthesis, but then they suddenly say, and what's that made out of? And why have you chosen that particular type of material? And what are the material properties? And I hope to be able to give you some good ideas on how to answer that. So let's start with a few definitions within material science. And so material science is really about exploring the properties of a material, but we can't just explore them by looking at a material. We actually have to apply a load to a material and see how that material behaves when a load is applied. And that's one of the key things about understanding material science, that it's how a material responds to a load which is applied to it. And of course, as you can imagine, a load is an externally applied force, and it can be applied in different directions like compression or tension, shear or torsion. And as soon as we apply a load to a body, there's going to be some internal effects or deformations of that particular kind of body. And those are the kind of effects that we're going to be studying in material science to give us a list of properties, mechanical properties or material properties of a certain type of material. And those are the kind of terms that we use. Those deformations that I mentioned that happen to a body when a load is applied to it can either be elastic deformations, which are temporary. In other words, when you remove the load, the shape of that material will go back to what it was before. And plastic deformations are permanent changes in length or shape. And in general, and we'll see that on the stress strain graph in a minute, the degree of deformation is proportional to the amount of load that is applied to a material. And then we also have a concept of elasticity, and that's important for us to understand because it's the ability of a material to return to its original resting length after a load has been applied and then removed. So, we'll see that on the stress strain graph as well, but these are just some of the terms that we're going to be looking at. What is stress in a material? So it's actually the intensity of an internal force. It's very similar to pressure. And in fact, it has the same units as pressure, which is Newton per meter square or force per area, otherwise known as pascals. So whilst we can understand if a pressure is applied externally, we can understand that. Actually, when we apply a pressure, when we apply a force to a body, we may not see any obvious deformation, but there will be an intensity of that internal force within the body. And that's really what stress is. It's used to analyze the internal resistance of a body to a load. And normally something actually has to go on in there, because if you apply Newton's third law is every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if you're applying a force onto a body, something is going to be happening within that body to resist the force that is applied on it, even if it doesn't move. So those are some of the principles. So stress basically comes in two forms. You can have a normal stress, which is a load, which is when a stress or force is applied perpendicular to the body that they act on. So that would be a typical example, would be a tensile or compressive stress, or you can have shear stresses, which you can see in this diagram down at the bottom, where the forces are parallel to each other, and they act in a different way because of that. So we've mentioned stress, and that has the units of Newton per meter squared or pascals. Now strain is measured as the change in length over the original length of an object. In other words, the length is measured in meters, so it's meters over meters, and therefore they cancel each other out. And so strain has no units. I've seen that come up in multiple choice questions, occasionally in a VIVA. What are the units of stress? Oh, they're Newton per meter squares. What are the units of strain? Answer, it has no units. It's a proportion. It's the change in length over the original length of a material. And what's interesting about strain is stress and strain are proportional to each other on a graph up to a certain limit. And I'm going to show you that in a second, but that is called Hooke's law. So those two are going to give you a straight line for an orthopedic material up to a certain limit. That means that they're proportional, and that limit, although it does have different names, which I'll go through, is generally referred to as the proportional limit. So I want to come on to the stress strain graph. But before I do, I just want to talk to you a moment about the Young's modulus, because the Young's modulus is actually a measure in the stress strain graph of the slope of that proportional zone within the elastic zone. And the Young's modulus, which I'll show you on the graph in a second, is a measure of stiffness of a material. And quite often there are questions about stiffness of a material because it does have a relation to the to the effects within a system, like, for instance, stress shielding and things like that. So we'll talk about that in a second as well. And the E, which is the measure of a Young's modulus of elasticity, is unique for every material. So sometimes we want to know where it is in relation to each other. So different relative Young's moduluses. And the higher the E, the greater the forces that a material can withstand. So let me show you this. This is quite an important graph to try and remember some of the details from. So it's the first time we've seen a stress strain graph. So you can see the stress here on this axis. You can see the strain down here on this axis. And what you can see is a straight line for all of these different materials, which I've drawn here, not to scale, but showing you the relative stiffnesses, because remember, it's the slope that dictates the stiffness of a material. That is the Young's modulus. And they're straight lines because, according to Hooke's law, the stress will be proportional to strain up until the elastic limit. And I've drawn them all for each case up to the elastic limit. So what we can see here on this stress strain graph is that some materials like ceramics are very stiff. Then we've got cobalt, chrome, then stainless steel and titanium. Then we've got cortical bone. And that's important because a commonly asked question is, which metal is most similar to cortical bone in its stiffness or in its Young's modulus? And the answer there would be titanium alloy. you can see that of the three main metals that we use in orthopedics, cobalt chrome is the most stiff, whereas stainless steel sits between cobalt chrome and titanium. You can see some of these other materials coming down here, like polymethyl methacrylate. You can see high density polyethylene there, cancellous bone, and then coming down to some of the biological tissues that really don't have much strength. So that's a pretty useful graph to remember, especially up at the top end, as those do tend to come up in multiple choice questions occasionally, if you haven't done that yet. So when it comes to the stress strain graph, the way that they're actually measured in metals is they put a set piece of metal within a special kind of vise, which I've shown here, and they pull that vise, they pull that metal apart, and they measure the stresses and the change in length within it. And so, just coming on to the next one. So here is the stress strain graph. This is the kind of graph that you may be expected to draw in a VIVA. They might say, can you draw me a stress strain graph? And they're going to ask you about certain points of it. So we have to remember stress is here on the y-axis, strain on the x-axis. And the first thing we could draw is a straight line for our representative material, because we know that stress is proportional to strain up until the proportional limit. And the slope of that is going to give us the Young's modulus. And that if we apply a, say, tensile force to this material before we get to the proportional limit, and we remove that stress at any point, the strain will be such that it returns exactly to the same length that it had at the beginning. And what that means is that the material is in the elastic zone. It is the elastic zone because it has the ability, if you remove the load at any point during that element of the stress strain graph, it will return to its original length. If you go beyond the proportional limit, then new things start to happen, which I'll show you. Unfortunately for us, the proportional limit has a number of different names, which you can read in different books, like proportional limit, yield point, elastic limit. But within the context, you just have to realize that there's this absolutely critical point on the stress strain graph where you move out of the elastic zone into the plastic zone, and that is something like yield point or proportional limit, depending on what the particular question is asking. So if we carry on then along the stress strain graph, what we're going to see is that this is exactly what we've looked at before. So we get to the proportional limit or the yield point. If we carry on applying this tensile strength, what immediately happens as you begin to get deformation within the material is it actually releases some of the stress in the material. So you can see the stress going down. If, for instance, you took away the load at that particular point, what would happen is that you would get some elasticity, but you would not return to the same length that you had when you first started. And so you would have a deformation. And we call that deformation, if a load is removed, the plastic strain deformation. In other words, you've reached the elastic zone, you've gone through the elastic zone, you've had permanent deformation, but then you've released it, and that's the final plastic strain deformation that you're left with. If you don't remove the load and you carry on applying increasing load to that material, you find that the stress begins to build up again. The stress builds up and up and up until it gets to a point where no more stress can be held within that particular material. And we call that the ultimate strength. In this case, it's a tensile test, so we would call it the ultimate tensile strength, but it can be the ultimate strength. Sometimes we talk about, is a material strong? Well, that all depends on how much stress, what is the maximum stress that that material can cope within it. And what then happens if you carry on applying force, even load, sorry, you carry on applying load even after you've reached your ultimate strength, the actual material itself begins to thin down in diameter until it gets to the point where it snaps and breaks. And that's why you get this necking, it's called, just a release of some of the stress just before the break point. It's because you're changing the shape of the piece of material that you're testing as that begins to really begin to pull apart. So, and that point where it pulls apart, we call the break point. So if we were to look at the whole of the graph, we would see that we have an elastic zone. That's absolutely critical. Nice straight line. Remember Hooke's law, stress is proportional to strain within the elastic zone, and that if we were to remove the load, it would come back to its original length. But if we go past the yield point or proportional limit, then we enter into this plastic deformation that ultimately goes up to the ultimate strength and then down to the break point. And all of that, within that, is called the plastic zone, because if we remove the load at any point during this, we will have some plastic strain deformation. And that is these are the really key points of the stress strain curve that we need to understand, because from that we get a lot of information. So the other thing that we can tell when we look at two different materials on a stress strain graph is whether they're brittle, and the opposite of brittle is ductile. And brittle basically means that the distance between the proportional limit and the break point is very close, whereas a ductile material is able to undergo a lot of plastic strain deformation or plastic deformation, and so the distance between the proportional limit and the break point is far. In this particular example, we would be looking at these two materials. If I asked you which was the strongest material, you could potentially say, and you'd be right, that the brittle material here is stronger because it's able to reach a slightly higher ultimate tensile strength than this more ductile material. So it's interesting, isn't it? So we have to get the terms precisely, but strength really relates to how much is the maximum amount of stress that can be contained within a material. Because the other element that we need to talk about is this concept of toughness. And what's important about material properties is to recognize a difference between the idea of strength, which is the ultimate tensile strength, or toughness, which is actually a measure of the total strain energy. And the total strain energy is the area underneath the stress strain graph. So what you can immediately tell is that when you have a more ductile material, it's going to have an increased range of this plastic deformation. There's going to be a long distance between the proportional limit there and the break point there. So a ductile material will have a lot of area under the graph. That is a measure of the total strain energy. And if you have a very high total strain energy, that's the amount of energy that a material is able to absorb before it breaks, then it will be a tough material. So perhaps you can see now the difference between strength and toughness. In this, I've gone back one slide, but in this slide, you can see that this material is strong, but this material is tough. So that gives you some more things that you can talk about if you're looking at a stress strain graph with somebody. A couple of other things that do come up that I want to mention about stress is that in terms of stress, there are two other sort of viscoelastic properties that we make use of in orthopedics. I haven't talked a lot about viscoelastic properties in this talk, but elastic we have talked about. Do you remember the elastic zone, the plastic zone? When you add visco, it's a measure of what fluids do. And so when you have biological tissues like bone, tendon, cartilage, they actually behave slightly like liquids and slightly like solids. And together they have this thing called viscoelastic properties. So when we're talking about bone now, we have these two other material properties that I'd like to mention. One of them is called creep and the other stress relaxation. Creep, actually, you don't see that so much with bone, but you see it with bone cement. And it's the ability of a material under a constant load to begin to flow like a liquid, ever so slowly, but it begins to do that. A good example of that would be in a very old building like a cathedral that's 1,000 years old. If you look at the stained glass windows in that, you see that although the glass is a solid, it's actually dripping over 1,000 years, and it's collecting at the bottom of the pane, and it's much thinner at the top of the pane. And we see that also in bone cement, where gradually over a 20-year period that polished tapered stem is inside the hip, for instance, it's actually creeping into the interstices of the bone over time because of the constant load applied to it because of the polished tapered stem. So that's something that can sometimes come up. And stress relaxation is a very practical thing that's worth knowing. If you're sticking in an intramedullary nail or perhaps an uncemented acetabular cup, but wherever you have a round area of bone and you are pushing something in to get a press fit and it's very tight, what's happening is you're creating a stress within the bone because you're applying a load. But one of the wonderful things about viscoelastic materials is that that stress will dissipate. That's called stress relaxation. So it gets a peak of stress, and then because it also behaves slightly like a liquid, it gradually dissipates. And that means that if you're hitting your acetabular cup in and you're hitting it really hard and fast, but not giving time for the stress, the Hooke stresses that are building up in the acetabulum to dissipate, then you can get a fracture. I've seen that with intramedullary nails going down a slightly unreamed, isthmus of a bone. If you hit it too hard and fast, you're not giving time for the bone to relax, and as a consequence, you can end up with fractures because you're not allowing stress relaxation to occur. So just coming on, just check the time, but I think we're okay for a few more minutes. I wanted to talk about some of the materials in particular that we use in arthroplasty in orthopedics. When we talk about arthroplasty and some of the complications that we get, we're mainly looking at, in this case, some of the complications of metal. And I want to mention fatigue failure. Now, if you take a paperclip and you just move it gradually up and down, eventually it will snap. And that is called fatigue failure. It's defined as repetitive loading cycles that are below the ultimate strength of material, but because there's so many of them, it actually ends up causing a fracture. And we can see that, we can often see it, for instance, in plates. When a fracture is slow to heal, we end up getting movement of the plate and then the plate will snap. They don't tend to snap because they're bad plates. They tend to snap because the fracture hasn't healed before you've got fatigue failure. But in some situations, and an example would be an airplane wing, airplane wings do move a little bit when you take off and land. You don't ever want the airplane wing to fall off. So there's this concept of an endurance limit. And that means no matter how many millions and millions and millions of times you put a material through a load, it will never reach the stress that will allow it to get fatigue failure. So you can repeatedly cycle it without fear of getting complications like fatigue failure. The problem is that endurance limit often means that things have to be very big. For instance, a plate would have to be massively bulky and not very practical. So in the end, sometimes you just can't use the endurance limit in orthopedic situations because it would be impractical. So what about the metals we use? And I'm just going to talk really about three main metals: stainless steel, cobalt chrome, and titanium alloy. And stainless steel, as you probably know, is surgical grade stainless steel 316L, L standing for low carbon. That does tell you that it has some carbon in it. And so sometimes you can find questions that ask you about what kind of stainless steel that is. And it's surprising how many things are found in the alloy of stainless steel. Iron is about 2/3, but you've also got, look how much chromium you've got and how much nickel. Quite a lot of nickel in there. And of course, some people have nickel allergies, so that's worth thinking about. So stainless steel is an alloy that's made up of about 2/3 iron, but then it's also got a lot of chromium, quite a lot of nickel, and it's got molybdenum. There are two metals that have molybdenum: stainless steel and cobalt chrome. There's no molybdenum in titanium. So if you get a question that's talking about that particular element, then it's either one or two, one of these. And of course, there is carbon in stainless steel, but in this case, it's very low carbon. And you can imagine if somebody was to say to you, if someone was to, you see this, someone's to give you like an extra total hip replacement in your VIVA and say, you know, what is this extra total hip replacement made of? You might say, that is a grade, surgical grade stainless steel 316L. It's an alloy of iron, chromium, molybdenum, carbon. And the material properties, well, it's strong, it's tough because it's ductile. You know, it has a Young's modulus. It'd be good to talk about that. That's not too far away from cortical bone. But some of the other good things are that it's biocompatible, so it doesn't cause a lot of reaction within the body, except for people that have a nickel allergy. So that's one thing to think about. Many of those things are true about cobalt, chrome as well. The key thing about cobalt and chrome is that those are the main elements of it. Cobalt, chrome, and then just like stainless steel, it's got this molybdenum in it. You could use all of the same terms to describe it, but if you were talking about the Young's modulus, which I think would be a good idea, you would say that cobalt chrome has the highest Young's modulus of the metals that we use in orthopedics. It's higher than stainless steel and it's higher than titanium. And therefore, whilst it has some good properties like, you know, wear properties, we have to be a little bit careful of things like stress shielding of bone. And in fact, some implants like the CPT implant, which is a hip implant, which is a polished tapered stem, is made out of cobalt chrome, and it's said to have a slightly higher periprosthetic fracture rate than the Exeter, which it looks very similar to, but they're made of different materials. And the stiffness of the cobalt chrome could be playing a factor in that. And the other key thing that gets asked about cobalt chrome is what if you use it in something like a metal on metal hip replacement? Obviously, you get a lot of chromium and cobalt ions, and that causes necrosis of the tissues around and can cause systemic problems as well. So the other metal I wanted to mention was the titanium. We use titanium a lot. If you can remember that it's mainly made out of titanium, but it's actually a titanium alloy, and it has some aluminium and some vanadium in it as well. And the lovely thing, there's a couple of really good things to remember about titanium. One is that its Young's modulus, that measure of stiffness, is the most similar to cortical bone of any of the metals that we've mentioned. It, just like the other metals, it's ductile, which makes it very tough, but also strong. And it's biocompatible. And one of the nice things is this particular property called self-passivation. So normally, if you take iron and it gets exposed to oxygen, it rusts. That's iron oxide. But if you take aluminium and you expose it to oxygen, it degrades into aluminium oxide, which is actually a ceramic. So you end up getting this layer of ceramic over the metal that protects it from further sort of corrosion. And titanium does that as well. So it creates a titanium oxide layer, which is actually a kind of ceramic, which stops it from undergoing any further corrosion. And that process is called self-passivation. It creates that layer that's resistant to corrosion. But you think titanium would be the perfect metal, but unfortunately it's got a weak area, and that is it's very poorly resistant to wear. I've not talked so much about wear because it's also a big subject, but in general, we don't want to use titanium in a bearing surface because it's poorly resistant to wear. A couple of other things just to mention are polyethylene. It's a plastic, so if you wanted to talk about its material properties, you could definitely talk about it being ductile. So it has a long range within that plastic zone. It's also got some good wear properties, but it has a low Young's modulus. You know where we use it. One or two things about the material properties of polyethylene that sometimes come up in that they can be modified by the radiation that's used to sterilize it. So actually radiation can improve its wear characteristics, but it has a negative effect on its Young's modulus, its ductility, and its strength. And historically, although they don't do it anymore, of course, they sometimes used to irradiate in air, but that created free radicals, which led to very poor wear characteristics. Moving on, bone cement. We know that it's made of polymethyl methacrylate. It's not an adhesive, rather a grout, and it helps to give us even load distribution. And one of the wonderful things about it, which we've mentioned already, is this ability for it to undergo creep. I've mentioned this word anisotropic, and that means, isotropic means that it has the same mechanical properties. It doesn't matter which direction the load is applied. But almost all materials, at least in the body, are anisotropic, and they will have different abilities to resist forces depending on whether they're in tension or compression. And people love to talk about vacuum mixing as well. You might have a view on that. So coming up towards the end now, but I just wanted to mention ceramics. Ceramics, if you were to talk about their material properties, they are brittle. They have a very short distance between the end of the elastic zone at the proportional limit and the breakpoint. They have a very high Young's modulus. It's even higher than cobalt chrome. They have this property called wettability. Although this is another one of those wear properties, its ability for a drop of water put on a ceramic head to spread over the ceramic head. And it does that in a much better way than if you were to put the same drop of water, for instance, on a stainless steel head. And you can polish them to get a very smooth surface, allowing you to have very low wear. So I'm sorry for the speed at which we've rushed through some of the mechanical properties. But we've looked at that stress-strain graph, and I would love it if by the end of this evening, you felt that you could draw a stress-strain graph and mention some of the key things on it, like the elastic zone, the plastic zone, the proportional limit. You could explain what Hooke's law was. You could explain what ductility, brittleness, strength, toughness, the area under the graph. That would be really good. And those things would get you through any VIVA question that you'd be asked on that kind of thing. We've talked a little bit about viscoelastic materials. In particular, I've mentioned creep and stress relaxation. We've talked about some of the particular materials. We've talked about 3 metals: cobalt, chrome, stainless steel, and titanium. And we've looked at 1 or 2 of the other materials that we use in orthopedics as well. So thank you so much, and happy to answer any of your questions.
That's lovely, Alan. Many thanks for this presentation. You've managed in half an hour to squeeze a lot of information in this presentation. It's wonderful, very useful, and very interesting as well. Lots of, I think you pitched it exactly at the level of the exam, what candidates need to know. And I wouldn't expect that candidates need to know any more than this at all. If you know what's in this lecture about principles of biomaterials, you'll get through the stations. So thank you very much, Alan. I enjoyed that, and I'm sure everyone did. It was lovely.
Thank you.
So there have been lots of questions which myself and the other mentors tried to answer. A lot of questions, I think, like, you know, maybe you could help us with that. But I think one of the candidates was, there's a bit of confusion about ductility of titanium and its notch sensitivity. And these obviously describe completely 2 different parts of the titanium. So notch sensitivity describe the surface of an implant as an articulating surface, but ductility describe the actual material from the inside and how it behaves. So I think in the exam, it's probably, you need to be careful what you're describing and just use the terminology right. So notch sensitivity, you can correct me, Alan, but it doesn't come into the equation of ductility at all, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's just describing the surface of the implant.
It's kind of the microscopic surface in a way, and it just means that actually it's easy to scratch it.
Yeah,
it's easy to scratch it, and when you get those scratches, they, for instance, if they're rubbing up against ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, they're going to scratch the ultra high molecular weight polyethylene, giving you increased wear debris. So it's very, very small scratches, but it's just not scratch resistant. So, but when we talk about ductility, that's true for all metals, and that is a slightly different thing. That's its ability to undergo plastic strain deformation. It's that long distance between the proportional limit and the break point.
Yeah, I think in the exam, the way I had it in my head is that when describing any material is describe, if asked about materials, describe the manufacturing of it, what is it made of, what are the surface properties, and what are the actual material properties. So I think, and if you just divide this into those components, it'll be a lot easier during the exam to go systematically. So there was some other questions. I think candidates wanted to know a lot about the difference between proportional limit, elastic limit, and the yield point. The first question is, do we need, for the FRCS, do they need to worry about the difference between them, or can we just describe them as one term as transitional points between the elastic and the plastic zones?
Exactly. So, I mean, I think if you're in a VIVA situation, you can describe it any way that you want. And most likely somebody will give you, I don't know about COVID, but often they used to just give you a pencil and a piece of paper and say, show me what you mean. The problem comes when you are answering multiple choice questions, because there, the same point could be coming up in different with different sort of names. All of those three things that you mentioned, the yield point, proportional limit, and elastic limit, are exactly the same thing. But sometimes in North America, they like to use yield point more than proportional limit. So there's just a sort of cultural difference in different parts of the world as to which term people prefer. And so I guess it depends which multiple choice that you're practicing on. But I would think for the VIVA, it's no problem. You just have to explain whichever term you use. I'm sure the examiners will be familiar with it. So you could just go ahead and use it.
That's lovely. Yeah, I think I agree with you. When I was doing the exam, I didn't really, it's so complex, and as you said, different references speak about them differently. So was one interesting point you mentioned about the titanium, the self-passivation of the titanium. Now, does that mean that titanium can be mixed with other metals? For example, can you put a titanium stem and cobalt chrome head?
Okay, so great. So it's a question about galvanic corrosion here. So I haven't really gone into the different types of corrosion, but galvanic corrosion means that you're going to get accelerated corrosion because of mixing two different metals and they're swapping electrodes. And the two metals, by the way, just before I answer your question, I feel like a politician, but I'll just get this in, because the two metals that get the most galvanic corrosion that you should almost always avoid mixing together are stainless steel and cobalt chrome. Actually, probably the correct answer for the exam is don't mix your metals because you're going to get galvanic corrosion. In reality, if you're going to have to mix one metal in, then titanium, because it's able to self-passivate, it actually is more resistant to galvanic corrosion than any of the other metals. So for the exam, avoid mixing metals. Always avoid mixing cobalt chrome and stainless steel, which are highly sensitive to galvanic corrosion. And remember that there's some resistance to galvanic corrosion in titanium because of the process of self-passivation.
That's lovely, Alan. I think you're very good at using the buzzwords, which they can describe a complex concept in few words. Well, I think all the candidates need to learn use these buzzwords, galvanic corrosion and so on. Hooke's law, all these things. They can mean a lot in the exam situation, and you could redirect the station according to that. So many thanks, Alan, for that. Unfortunately, for you, because of this interesting lecture. Now everyone asking more. They want to know about other parts of the material. They want to know more about tribology part, about hysteresis and so on. So, but I think this maybe if you could kindly find us time in the future again for another lecture. I think that will be very popular for everyone. But obviously you cannot cover all aspects of the biomaterials in a short lecture like that, but this is very stimulating, this one. So thank you very much, Alan. Now I know you have a lot more still, so we'll get on with that. So next part will be the MCQ part. So if Ruth could kindly put the questions on. These, please everyone answer these questions, 3 questions. You have just about 3 minutes to answer. All anonymized. I encourage you all to attempt, please. At least you will know if you've answered correctly, and you will know if you have a deficiency that you need to cover. And also, we know how much you benefited from the lecture today. Alan will take us through the answers afterwards with some explanation. Questions, please.
Great, yeah. So I can see that there's a lot of concordance on that first question. Just going to pull it back up, sorry. So which of the following materials has a Young's modulus of elasticity most similar to cortical bone? So this is really the one, you may remember that one graph of the relative Young's modulus. That's one that's worth putting in the memory somewhere, at least the first part of it, because titanium is the correct answer. So you guys have done so well on that, because it's the metal that has the closest Young's modulus to cortical bone. Zirconia is a type of ceramic used particularly in femoral heads, but actually there's one type of knee replacement that's also using that, the femoral part. And so it's being a ceramic, it actually has a very high Young's modulus. Stainless steel is actually the next one up from titanium. And then the third one up is the cobalt chrome. And then the last one, and the most stiff of all, is the ceramic, of which we have 2 represented here, the zirconia and the stainless steel. And I'm just going to show you this slide again. So you can see there that that's basically what we're looking at. We can see the different ones that I mentioned. So the most important thing to remember there is really the order that you've got here. And even if you can't remember that, just remember titanium equals cortical bone. I think you've done that pretty well because you all got that right, more or less. Okay, next one. Which of the following defines the stress at which a material begins to undergo plastic deformation? So this is a question about the proportional limit, but they're probably not going to use that term. So they've said toughness. Now, you remember that toughness is the area under the stress strain graph, and materials that are tough have high ductility because there's a long distance between the yield point and the break point. Ultimate strength is actually the highest point in the stress strain graph where it gets the maximum stress that it can hold, so it's not that one. The yield strength. This is yet another term. I would have been happier. This is taken straight from the Orthopedic's UK guide exam. So they put the yield strength. Now, the strength, remember, it's a measure of the stress that a material can hold, and it's measured by the amount of stress that can be measured on the y-axis. And it is actually a certain strength at which point it yields and moves from the elastic to the plastic zone. And so that is the correct answer, yield strength. Fatigue strength, that's something different. Remember, that's when it's below the level which is the breaking point stress, and but it's multiple cycles which cause it to fail. and endurance limit is related to fatigue strength, but it's the maximum stress that you can do unlimited amounts of cycling and not get fatigue strength. So yield strength is the correct one there. And the key word there really is yield. Yield is the term that describes going from the elastic to plastic zones. Then the last question, the elements of chromium, molybdenum, cobalt are the basic components of which following implant materials? So aluminium oxide, no, that isn't the correct one. That is basically made of aluminium and oxygen. Oh, I can't say it. Cobalt chrome or cobalt alloy is the correct answer. So remember, it's mainly chromium, but it has cobalt molybdenum in there as well. And then stainless steel has molybdenum, but it doesn't have any cobalt or chrome. It's iron, molybdenum, nickel, and a little bit of carbon. And PMMA, that's polymethyl methacrylate. Nobody thought that. Tantalum, I haven't mentioned tantalum, but tantalum is a rare earth metal, and it's used by particular companies because you can get very nice sort of modeling, microarchitecture of tantalum, but it's not that commonly used, although it is probably something that we ought to start thinking about in the future, including as a material. But it itself is an element. It's a metal element. So that's the answer to the polls. And I don't know if you want to follow up, Firaz.
No, I think that's fantastic. It's very good to see that most candidates have answered the correct one. Thank you for the explaining. Obviously, there's some confusion about the stainless steel. Obviously, stainless steel doesn't contain chromium and cobalt. So, so this very, I think this very typical FRCS exam questions. And it's good to get used to this question. So it was very suitable. Thank you very much, Alan. So we move on now next to, Alan has prepared the 3 case discussions, typical exam case discussions, and he's going to tell us the perfect answer or a model answer for these 3. And that's to prepare you guys for the VIVA components afterwards.
Thank you so much. So I think when I was thinking about case discussion and material properties, I was trying to think, well, how does this actually come up in my experience? I think the way that it most commonly comes up is people ask you some simple questions to start off with, and then suddenly you find yourself talking about material properties. And one of the ways, I'll just get my slides up for that. One of the ways that they do that is looking at the hip replacement. So in my experience, they'll say something like, "Oh, Alan, have you ever seen a hip replacement?" You're like, "Yep." And then they'll say, "Well, what hip replacement do you use in your practice?" And then they say, "Well, I use the Exeter total hip replacement and a cemented stem and a cemented cup." And then the very next question that they might follow on with is say, I use that. So what is the Exeter hip replacement made out of? And then it can become a little bit embarrassing if you've said that you use that one in your practice, but you don't really know what it's made out of. But hopefully, whichever one you pick, then I think you should be able to talk a little bit about it. So for instance, I think if you pick a cemented femoral stem, you need to be able to talk about what it's made of. And so I mean, you could pick whichever one you want, but if you pick the Exeter total hip replacement, then you could talk about the fact that it's made of surgical grade stainless steel. That's the 316L low carbon stainless steel. And you think that that is a good choice for a stem because it's going to have a Young's modulus, which is not too far off the cortical bone, but it's better than titanium because titanium has very low resistance, scratch resistance. And when you're talking about putting it inside the polished, having a polished tapered stem inside cement, you're going to end up getting scratching of the metal on the cement, which would create a lot of titanium wear debris. And that's why stainless steel is much better than titanium. And it's the next one that's closest to cortical bone in the metals that we use in its Young's modulus. Obviously, if they say, what is Young's modulus? You can say it's a measure of stiffness of the material. And they can say, well, if Young's modulus is important, what if we have too high a Young's modulus? And you could talk about some implant companies make a polished tapered stem with cobalt chrome, and that would be the Zimmer prosthesis, which uses, it's called the CPT, and that particular prosthesis uses cobalt chrome, so it has a higher Young's modulus. But there is some concern with that prosthesis that it has a higher periprosthetic fracture rate because it's potentially a very stiff area in an elderly patient going into a less stiff area at the end of the prosthesis, creating this sudden step off and a place where stress can concentrate, resulting in periprosthetic fractures. Although, of course, it's hotly debated. But you could talk then about the material principles, why stainless steel has the advantage over cobalt chrome. So when it comes to the stem, you could also talk about the advantage of using polymethyl methacrylate. You could talk about the way that the cement creeps over time and allowing a sort of repeated microlock because of the constant load that the polished tapered stem applies on the cement. As the bone remodels around the cement, it allows that cement to continue to creep and create the microlock over time, minimizing the chances of loosening. Of course, you must say that in order to get that constant load, you can't have end loading of the prosthesis. And that's why you have that small sort of air pocket at the end of the prosthesis, which is created by the centralizer to allow there to be space there to give load along the sides of the polished tapered stem. And you could also mention how important it was to have a kind of uniform thickness of cement around the polished tapered stem so that you could allow that load to dissipate evenly. And 2 millimeters is thought to be the ideal amount. When it comes to the acetabulum, most of the bearing surfaces or the bearing surface that I would choose if they were asking me what I used in my practice would be ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. And I would use cross-linked polyethylene because it gives better wear properties. And I would use cement in this situation, or I would use an uncemented cup and a hybrid. And you could talk about whether you would modify your practice dependent on the patient that you were treating. For instance, a young patient might be able to tolerate greater Hooke stresses that would be created from a press fit, uncemented stem. And they might ask you about Hooke stresses, and you could mention about stress relaxation being important to leave time between impact to allow the stress to dissipate so that you don't end up fracturing the bone. And you could talk about that. So then what I would also say is that you, if you like, the second part of my case discussion is about what if you want to use an uncemented femoral stem. I know that they're becoming more popular, especially for younger patients, where you have a good morphology of your proximal femur. And if you're going to use an uncemented femoral stem, or if they ask you about that, you could change your material. And in this case, titanium would probably be the preferable material. You're not so much worried about the scratch of the titanium against the bone inside the femur. But here, what you want is to have a Young's modulus of your metal that's as close as possible to that of cortical bone to minimize the effect of stress shielding. I can tell you more about stress shielding if you want. They might ask you about that. But basically, stress shielding is where all of the load is being carried by the implant to the distal bone. And the consequence of that is that according to Wolff's law, which is form follows function, if the bone is not being put under stress, then the bone will begin to gradually dissolve away, and you'll have a reduced bone density in those places. So that's stress shielding. Some advantages of titanium are that it has a great Young's modulus, but it also allows you to get different kinds of coating on it. You can either actually change the shape of the metal to create a better lock into the bone, or you can blast it with this plasma spray to put a ceramic like hydroxyapatite onto the outside of the titanium. It bonds really well at about 2000 degrees centigrade. And that then creates a very good ability for the titanium to bond into the bone. But they might say, would you use a titanium head with your titanium stem? Answer, no, because titanium is not scratch resistant. And so it makes a very poor surface for bearing. And so perhaps a much better bearing surface would be something like a ceramic head. And then you, again, in the same way as we talked about for the previous case of cemented stem, you could talk about whichever acetabular cup you wanted. Most likely, unless you're doing a reverse hybrid, most likely, if you have an uncemented femoral stem, you'll use an uncemented acetabular component as well. And the best acetabular component would probably either be tantalum, which we did mention earlier. You could talk about that. That would be something like continuum cup, or you could talk about using titanium, again minimizing stress shielding, and often they have special coatings on them like a hydroxyapatite, and inside that cup you could either have a ceramic or a polyethylene cup. We could talk about that. So the last bit of this case discussion that I wanted to talk about was about knee replacements, because that's another way that this particular question about material properties can come up. They say something like, oh, you know, what type of knee replacements do you use in your practice? And then you say the name of it. In my practice, I'd use a Genesis 2 made by Smith and Nephew. It doesn't really matter what you pick, to be honest with you, as long as it's not crazy. But pick anything that's within the top 5 on the National Joint Registry. But take a moment to find out what the materials are in those, so that if anyone asks you about them, or if you get the opportunity to talk about it, you can talk about it with knowledge. So most knee replacements actually use cobalt chrome for the distal femur, for coating the distal femur. And the reason for that is that it actually isn't such a worry about stress shielding right down there like it would be in the proximal part of the femur. And you can really polish cobalt chrome so that you can get great wear properties. The tibial tray, of course, is made of ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, often cross-linked. But interestingly, the base plate is normally made of titanium alloy, which is a little strange because actually it's often cemented in place. And like I mentioned in the proximal femur, we don't like to mix cement and titanium, and yet in the proximal part of the tibia, it seems to be okay to mix those two together. Perhaps there's much less movement. Obviously, we're not relying on a polished tapered stem type model in the knee. And so in general, those are the 3 main components of a knee replacement: cobalt chrome for the femoral component, ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene for the insert and also for the patella button, and then a titanium base plate, which is cemented in, both sides often cemented in, although of course there are plenty of uncemented total knee replacements as well. I've got this material, see if it comes up on the screen, but there's also another material which you might see. One particular company makes a material called oxinium. It's the only one that really looks black like this, and that's a ceramicized metal. It's a kind of hybrid of ceramic on the outside and metal on the inside, so that it's less brittle and less likely to fracture as total knee replacement femoral components made of ceramic are, but because it behaves like a metal, so less likely to fracture. But the very outer part of the metal is actually oxidized to create a smooth ceramic layer that can be polished. That's that particular proprietary brand called oxinium. So really that, I think, brings me to the end of those sort of case discussions. And I just wanted to give you an answer to the kind of question that you might get. What hip replacement do you use? What is it made of? What are the material properties of those particular things that it's made of? So hopefully, if you get asked that, you'll have some ideas on how to answer it.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and that covers it really. I think these are most commonly asked scenarios when they. So prepare when an examiner asks you what hip or what knee replacement you use. They're not just interested to know the brand. You could throw in any brand, as Alan said, as long as it's a well-established one. But they just want to take you further to know why you use this. So prepare one good answer and be ready that everyone talks about Exeter. So everyone will be prepared, examiners and everyone. So if you're going to say Exeter in the exam, you have to know all about the ins and outs of Exeter and how it functions and the whole Exeter philosophy. So thank you very much, Alan.
The clinical and the VIVA, they will be in the same venue. One of the changes that they divided the candidates into two main groups, and that will allow everybody to stay for 1.5 day maximum, 2 days in Glasgow, and then they will ask you to travel straight away. So the red and the blue groups, the red group will stay Sunday, do the VIVA all day, finish the VIVA, and the Monday morning they will finish the clinical and they will leave by lunchtime. The other group will start Monday afternoon doing the clinicals, and then the Tuesday will be whole day. When you come, there will be temperature check, and then they will do your registration. If your temperature is high, obviously they will ask you to leave, and it's a one-way system. Everybody should wear a mask all the time. They have got plenty of masks everywhere, so you don't need to bring your own mask. I find it a bit difficult to talk while you're stressed in a noisy like hall where everybody's talking, especially if English is not your first language and you have an accent. It might be difficult for the examiner because they might normally they rely on reading your lips and they can't do that. So I would suggest for candidates preparing for the exam to try and practice their VIVAs while they're wearing masks. That might help. So it will be a big conference hall. The tables are arranged with social distancing, but there will be no screen or any visors or anything. You will sit with 2 examiners. It's the same venue for both the clinical and the VIVA, where you will be. It's quite relieving because you'll be used to it. It's not a new place. You will do the VIVA, for example, the first day, and then the second day will come for the clinical, exactly the same place. This is a picture actually of the actual place where you should be going. In this hall, you will be waiting, and then the hall for the exam will be just to the right. This is a hall where you will be sitting in different range tables. And in the VIVA, there's not many changes happen in the VIVA. I've noticed because I have taken this exam before. The difference is mainly that you would definitely need to know at least 4 differential diagnoses for everything. And that is, I would say that is the most important point. If there is one thing I would ask the examiner to take home message, it would be this one, because I will explain this later, but if you don't know the differential for everything, then you would struggle to score marks, because there will be questions on these differentials on each of them, and they will show you X-ray of each of them. So you might be shown an X-ray for all of the possible differentials and asked to how you would approach everyone. If you miss one of the main differentials, you miss a lot of marks, and these marks of that differential will be automatically lost. I'll just give you an example to explain this, because this is a very important point. It is in the VIVA, but also I noticed this in the clinicals. So see that patient, you would say, I can see there is a left side wasting on the supra and infraspinatus, and I can see prominence of the spinal scapula. That's a level 6 question answer. But if you are preparing well for this exam, you would avoid being asked about all the differentials by commenting your first comment and avoiding prompting. You would mention all the differentials from there. So you would say, I will be looking at the deltoid if it's wasting or not. The deltoid is not wasted. I'm thinking this is not brachial plexus or persona alterna. I'm suspecting this most likely rotator cuff arthroplasty. Looking at the winging also, and that will also give you an impression whether it's a brachial plexus injury or a rotator cuff arthroplasty. And also commenting on the other side, is unilateral or bilateral, will give the impression that you're talking about the facioscapular humeral dystrophy, which is also one of the differentials. And say I would like to look at the face, look for Horner syndrome, and look for transverse smile, and asks the patient to whistle. By saying that from the beginning, you would stop the examiner asking you about the differentials, which are, now you mentioned all the differentials, and the examiner cannot fail you. So these are like very similar to one of the questions I had, and the case was maybe talking about one of them, but I noticed the examiner have shown me X-ray or a picture for all of the 3 or 4 differentials. So they might not ask you about all these things. The white thing is the history finding, and how would you differentiate between these? The blue is how would you differentiate in examination? The investigation findings in yellow, and the treatment in black. Okay, so persona alterna, young patient, it's painful, there's no trauma. You differentiate that in a history from rotator cuff, where the patient is older, it's unilateral, there is shoulder pain, most likely this patient had a fall or dislocation before, or maybe there is no trauma. Facioscapular humeral dystrophy, there's a family history, it's painless. And you go like that. They might not ask you everything, but they will make sure that you can differentiate between the important differential for every single case. And then they will come back and concentrate on the main diagnosis. That's most likely the diagnosis of the case. And they will ask you a bit more question about the causes, like if it's persona alterna, they'll ask you, what do you think the causes is? Then you talk about brachial neuritis, whether it's viral or other causes. So for the intermediates, you're expected to demonstrate clinical tests without prompting. And that was said to us in the briefing when they said you try to demonstrate the clinical test in yourself, and because you will not be allowed to touch the examiners or and there is no patients. So you need to think of reaching the diagnosis before you get into the X-ray. You can have also, because this is all virtual now, you can have a lot of rare cases that normally they wouldn't come to the exam. You can have also pediatric cases. As I said, at some point, I felt that I had to stand up and take a few steps away from the examiners, because they asked me to demonstrate how I would do the movement of the shoulder and test the rotator cuff in myself. And I looked around, I found most of the candidates standing up, and as if we're doing group yoga. Taking history, there's some changes here, really important to focus on. There's 2 ways of taking history in the intermediate. One will be a traditional, conventional way where one of the examiner will be the patient. They will give him a name, and you will approach him as a patient. He will answer the patient, and he will give you a very nice history. 5 minutes more than enough to take you want. The difficult scenario is when the asking examiner is the same one who gives you the history. And this happened to me and happened to Joe as well in one of the intermediates, where the examiner will say, well, you have a patient of this. What do you want to ask in history? And then everything you said, he will say, why are you asking about this? What? And they will just grill you every question. I notice in that station, the other examiner will just be writing and sitting there. He will not open his mouth till the end of the intermediate case. So you will be taken by one examiner through the whole 15 minutes. So it's very important in that situation to not rush, because this is the same person. He will give you the positive findings. So if you say in the history, I would like to ask about handedness, about occupation, and about the presenting complaint in the same sentence, then he might not give you all that. So you have to ask and wait for him to answer your question. If you don't ask about anything, he will just ignore it, and you will count it as you don't ask, you didn't tick the box for that one. As I said, you need to justify why you're asking every question. So you need to be really careful of not asking a question that is not relevant. They will look at you as not as a MRCS candidate rather than FRCS. And for example, don't ask about family history in a patient who is post-traumatic non-osteoarthritis of the knee, for example. They will not like this. Always remember the safety questions, and this will be very important. And I notice the examiner will, if you don't, they will prompt you to ask about it, especially in spinal cases. You need to really make sure that you're asking about these. So just remember, these scenarios are made very carefully. We noticed that all the examiners and in the briefing, they were very worried about how we're gonna respond to this and about the feedback. And they told us they have tested this several times between themselves. So every scenario is carefully put, and any positives they give you in the history, that is not for fun. That will be a question, a positive finding. They will expect you to respond to it and to show your higher order thinking. So for example, if they say in the past medical history they have asthma, you have to say either in the same time to the patient, or if you have good short-term memory, keep it to the discussion, but you have to mention about you suspecting about steroids because this patient takes steroids, you asking about hip pains because they might have AVN, you talking to the anesthetist because these patients might need some steroids with anesthesia. Also, another case like protein CNS deficiency, you have to ask about medications because these patients take warfarin, and you have to mention that you would stop this before the surgery. And there is that. So this is about the history. On clinical examination, there's a very important point you have to put in your mind, that you have to remember you are not scored for knowledge here, you are scored for skills. So it's shown a clinical picture. You will be shown by the end of the history. The examiner will turn his laptop or his tablet and he will show you a clinical picture, and you need to describe it as you would examine this patient. So by looking, and then I would feel for this and I would move this. Remember, intermediate case, because it's just talking on the examination, you can go very quick. In 1 or 2 minutes, you can say all the sequence of the of what you're going to examine for, but they will stop you to make sure that you know what you're talking about, and they will not make it easy for you. So I would think that in intermediate case, you still need to go systematic by, for example, in the hip, you have to look from the front, from the back, from the side. You have to walk the patient, do Trendelenburg, sit the patient, lie the patient down, and do the leg lengths and these things. But you mention it very quickly to get to the meat, because if you don't go very quickly, also you will lose some marks. They will get you to that point, and then the examiner will give you the findings of what you're asking for. So if you've got a leg length discrepancy, for example, which can come very frequently in the intermediates, they want you to get to the Gileadi test. They will not show you a simple Gileadi test where there is like shortened tibia and that's it, and the rest is normal. They will show you something complicated, and they will test your high order thinking. And unfortunately, this will be your competence question. If you don't pass that question or go beyond that, you will not pass the examination, or you might not fail the whole intermediate. So one of the scenarios you could have, for example, one leg shorter. The patient had, when you do the Gileadi test, they will test that you know that you're going to put the heels together, and then how you're going to check the tibia, how you're going to check the femur, and then your comment will be, for example, the shortening is below the knee, and then, oh, I noticed also the femur on the same side is longer, and then they'll ask you why, and then, oh, I can see some scars. This patient had lengthening on the same side where he had the shortening, and then they will ask you that, then it will turn into VIVA. So you need to really understand the concept of every clinical test that should be learned in depth. And you need to know the false negatives and false positives of every test. Like if the patient has fusion of the hip, Trendelenburg test will be negative, although the abductors might be weak. So how to prepare for this clinical, I would suggest for all the candidates taking the exam soon is to go to this book, Nick Harris and Fazal Ali book, and trying to find all the important clinical tests and ask themselves questions about that test and know everything around it. For example, if you ask to assess the collaterals, they will ask you why you need to flex the knee to 30 degrees, the elbow to 30 degrees, and you know that's disengage the olecranon of the coronoid fossa to be able to assess the collaterals. For Trendelenburg, they will ask you about hip fusion. If it is fused hip or fused knee, how would you perform the test? As I said, Gileadi will not be straightforward. Coleman block tests, they will ask you about the possibility if it does not correct. So it should be either hindfoot driven or, for example, stiff. But you would confirm by doing the movement of subtalar joint. Thomas test as well. They would not give it straight, they will give you with fused hip or knee. Else, for example, also, you need to check that the DIP joint is double first before you do the test. You need to check for scars, that there is no fusion or there is no screw gone just under the nail plate. And that's as well as for dial test. You need to ask yourself why you're doing the posterolateral corner in 30 degrees, why you're doing the PCL in 90 degrees, can the PCL be injured while the posterolateral corner is intact? A lot of questions that will come up in the next exams about these things. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of revising these things. The discussion will be like a normal, but I don't think the discussion will be anything different from what we do already. But do not be alarmed by there's no x-rays, because actually these things, we realize it takes a lot of time, and the examiners knew that, and they did not, most of the cases, even in the intermediates, there is no x-rays. So that's normal. If you don't see an x-ray, that's very normal. You should come up with a clear management plan that should be targeted to the patient you have seen and not just a generic management plan. You need to be slick to read the consent, because in every intermediate case, there is some marks put for the consent. And I have been asked about it in both intermediates. So do not miss these marks. Be very slick, and trying to do drawing is a very good idea of consenting, and most of the examiners will like it. I think that's the end of my part, and my colleague Joe will finish the short cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mohammed. So for the short cases, briefly, just in 5 minutes, I would like to just highlight the differences between the normal and this time. So this time, it's the same, 3 upper, 3 lower, but there is more and more spine cases. There is more and more pediatric cases, and more cases that we don't really, we didn't really have on a regular basis on every in every exam before. So the scope has increased. It almost always starts with a clinical photograph, okay, of the main deformity. It's almost always there is a finding in this clinical photograph. It's not just a subtle finding, it's a major finding. Saying that, if you can't see it, just ask the examiner. But usually it's very obvious. And if it is, it's usually one main diagnosis with that deformity. It's not a differential. If there is any important differential, okay, say, but usually it's one diagnosis for one deformity. Next, please, Mohammed. Be slick in describing, because you're not marked for just describing the what you see. Okay, this is actually, it's just the look. You look to this, okay, so this is a clinical photograph of scoliosis, and then you start, say, mentioning the shoulder, the waistlines, the pelvic obliquity. You have to, this is the main point, you have to say any positive and any negative points, any associated conditions. So whether or not you can see, in this case, whether or not you can see tuft of hair, whether or not you can see cafe au lait patches, whether or not you can see any associated or causative diseases. Then, if you know if there is any differentials, briefly mention them, and then go to the meat straight away by not wasting time about, well, I will look to the patient from the front, from the side, from the back. I will look from the front for shoulder level and from the back for shoulder. No, just go for the meat of the exam or the test that you will do to either affect your diagnosis or affect your management plan. Next, please, Mohammed. And then describe that main test. They will ask you about, for example, here, I will do Adam forward test. So I will do Adam forward test to see rib hump or rib prominence, and how would you do it? I will stand behind the patient. I will ask the patient to do this and this and this. Okay, that's how the short cases were done. For the first minute you describe, for the second minute you're describing the very important tests that will affect your management plan. Then if there is anything that they are that you asked about in the short cases, like if you asked about cafe au lait patches, just, and they can show you either another picture of cafe au lait patches for that, or they can actually zoom in to show you, oh, there is cafe au lait patches, which happened with me. Okay, then the brief thing about the management. So, for example, just a quick example, this case, okay, this is a clinical photograph of a child suffering from cubitus varus. Then he will ask you, what is your differential here? So you can mention that the two most common differentials is either a malunited supracondylar fracture humerus versus a lateral condylar fracture. The next question would be, okay, so how would you differentiate that? If you go for the X-ray and to calculate the Bowman angle, which like that, no, they will tell you, sorry, there is no X-ray, we don't have the X-ray, and you are not supposed to ask for the X-ray before clinical examination. They want to differentiate according to the clinical differentiation. So they will ask you what test you will do. You will say the equilateral triangle. Next, please. So the equilateral triangle briefly is that if the edges of the triangle are equal, so that means the deformity is coming from outside the triangle. That means it is a supracondylar fracture. If they are not equal, that means the affection of from inside the triangle, that means it is a lateral condylar friction. Simple as that. You have to know the concept of the test, how to perform the test, and why you are doing the test. Next one, please, Muhammad. Hello?
Yeah.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay.
I hear you.
Yeah. So for the discussion, it's the last minute or two. It's a normal VIVA, but don't expect X-ray, MRI scan, or anything like that. It's basically a normal VIVA. Saying that, they expect you to know what will you find in the X-ray. For example, in this scoliosis, if it's cafe au lait neurofibromatosis, what are the significant findings in that X-ray you are looking for? So that's the main VIVA here. The VIVA starts here, and then the management. Brief management, and then the higher order thinking. Okay, next one, please. So take home message about the short cases briefly. Don't panic. If not clear, just ask what can I see here, or I want to see whether or not there is that sign. Don't waste time describing the clinical photograph. You're not scored high about just waffling around. Okay, this is a male, this is a female, blah, 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 if it's not significant. Prepare differentials if they are important, and then describe the tests. Okay, description of the tests and why you are doing the special test, not all the tests, not the classical format of look, feel, move. You don't have a patient. You have an examiner in front of you. He's frowning to you all the 5 minutes, okay? And if you waste your time about, I will look at the patient around and around, okay, he will be very annoyed. Thank you very much and good luck. Questions? I know there's hundreds of questions here.
No, very, very brilliant. Thank you very much, Muhammad and Joe, for your insights on this exam, and congratulations again for passing. Seem to be a lot of changes, lots of pros and cons for the new format, but whatever it is, we just got to get on with it. And so, as you said, probably, there are no patients, so maybe a little bit better interaction with the examiner, but then now they have the freedom of bringing any case they wish. They're not restricted by availability of patients anymore. So we've got to accommodate for that in our preparation. So thank you very much, Muhammad and Joe, again. I think we will end this teaching session with this. I'd like to thank Ruth and Hannah from OR UK for sticking with us and for organizing this beautifully, this session. A lot of hard work behind the scenes to get this up and running. Thanks to my colleagues at the FRCS Mentor Group and to those who took part in the VIVA, the examiners, Nikki, David, and Abdullah, and the candidates as well for coming forwards.